So let's start with the Gospel of Thomas, Logion 65. We don't consider this inspired, but following Dei Verbum, number 19, following the historical truth of the Gospels, Pontifical Biblical Commission, sections 16 through 19, following the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 126, which acknowledges these documents, we understand the Gospels to be something that is produced through a developmental process, not static. So let's take Thomas seriously. He said, a usurer owned a vineyard and rented it to some tenants so they could work it and he could collect its crop from them. He sent his slaves so the farmers could give him the fruit of the vineyard. They seized the slave, beat him, and almost killed him. And the slave returned and told his master. His master said, perhaps he didn't recognize him. He sent another slave, and the farmers beat that one as well. Then the master sent his son and said, perhaps they'll show my son some respect. Because the farmers knew that he was the heir to the vineyard, they seized him and killed him. Whoever has ears, let him hear. He said, that's all the context you get, folks. A usurer. We could translate that maybe as creditor. Question, in the Old Testament, what was the legal rate of interest charged on loans? 0%. The sin of usury, right? 0. Go to Aristotle in the Mediterranean. Money that makes money is unnatural, contrary to nature. How different that is from our world, huh? Huh? Big time different, huh? Okay, to charge interest on a loan in the Old Testament was called the sin of usury. So to begin a story, there was a guy who was a usurer. What kind of guy are we talking about? Are we talking about an analog for God? The kingdom of heaven is like a usurer. What? No, are we talking about a character who should be emulated? No. Hardly. He's wicked. He's a violator of the law of God. A usurer owned a vineyard. Middle Eastern peasants don't own vineyards, folks. They can't afford to do it. Growing a vineyard required an enormous capital investment. Once you plant a vineyard, you get no crops for 4 years. You don't get a decent crop for 5 years. No peasant could survive without an income for 5 years. Thus, the only people in Syro-Palestine in antiquity who grew grapes were wealthy absentee landowners who usually acquired the land from peasants, like the people Jesus mainly ministered to and healed, via debt foreclosure, and who then abandoned the growing of barley and wheat, which the peasants used subsistence farming for food to survive, and turned the whole damn thing into a cash crop. This garnered a high cash return because there was a high value among Greco-Roman Mediterranean elites for wine in antiquity. So 2 indicators right away at the beginning of this story in the gospel called Thomas, before the Gnostic stuff gets added, inform us that Jesus was telling a story about a greedy elite, a conniving, godless, ruthless son of a bitch. Imagine if Jesus is telling this story in a Galilean village where there are mostly poor peasants, many of whom have been driven off their ancestral land and means to survive as the result of kangaroo courts serving the elites into debt foreclosure. How would his audience react to a story that began, a usurer owned a vineyard? Happy with that? Yeah. In the Roman Empire, all mortgages ran for a single year of July 1st to June 30th. June 30th came to be known in the Roman Empire as moving day. If you couldn't come to pay by June 30th, your household complex with 50 to 100 people, that's right, 50 to 100 people living together, got foreclosed on, off you go, maybe even as a refugee. The wealthy elites of Jesus' day controlled the courts. They bribed the judges heavily to ensure judgments of foreclosure. Consider the Lord's Prayer and his petition. It says, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." Understand that, folks, is a peasant's prayer. When we mistranslate at the end, "and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil," that's not what the Greek says. The Greek literally says, "do not put us to the honor test," with a peasant tenant context suggesting a kangaroo courtroom setting. It is a prayer begging the patron God of Israel to prevent the elites from having them dragged before a kangaroo court, publicly humiliated and shamed in front of a bribed judge, and destroyed. The debt crisis in the Galilee of Jesus' day had worsened to such a degree that only 3 elite families owned half the arable land in the Galilee. The Herodians, the ruling family, the Hasmoneans, the still elites, even in Jesus' day, and the Benim Hassan, the Hassan family. This meant that the entire households of 50 to 100 persons each, sometimes entire villages, were driven off their ancestral land and had precious few options. Here's one of your options: become a tenant farmer. They could become tenant farmers on their own ancestral land, which meant that they owed 35% of the produce of the land back to the wealthy absentee landlord who had acquired it through crooked means, who in turn was going to transform your land, which you used to survive, into cash cropping with grapes that you can't do anything with. Given the fact that the margin of liability was 5 to 10%, understand what's going to happen, folks. These peasants are going to go farther and farther into debt. Imagine Jesus telling a story like this in a village where a lot of the village men have lost their land. Their families haven't been driven off their land and now have been forced to become tenants. Of course, there were other options. Option 2, that choice of Simon Zealotes at one point and Judas Iscariot, were to become rebel bandits. Many of the peasant village men who underwent this humiliation and injustice fled into the hills and formed guerrilla bands. These social bandits were like first century Israelite Robin Hoods. They robbed from the greedy elite and they gave to the poor. Gangs of these social bandits were roaming the countryside in Jesus' day. Given all of this auxiliary background information, what Jesus is doing is telling a story about a pretty volatile situation to villages full of desperate people hanging on the precipice of survival. Put yourself into the shoes of that original first century Middle Eastern audience. If one more of these elite sons of bitches takes away our land, what am I going to do? What would you do? You're in that shape. Where honor is everything, by the way, in the Middle East, and Mediterranean world of the first century. Not money, honor. So the Gospel of Thomas, Logion 65 reads, "He said a usurer owned a vineyard and rented it to some tenants." Are these the original owners? So they could work it and he could collect its crop from them. These tenant farmers are the peasants who have to pay 35% interest to the wicked, greedy usurer, the absentee landlord, who lives in the city. He never sees these people. He works through stewards. We'll see them later on this weekend. Gospel of Thomas, Logion 65 continues. He sent his slaves so the farmers would, this is a steward, would give him the fruit of the vineyard. They seized the slave, beat him, and killed him. Almost killed him. Is that surprising that they almost killed him? Shouldn't be surprising, my friends. Not in this agonistic culture, in this desperate situation. This is a story of violence, labor violence, that occurred because of economic injustice in this ancient Middle Eastern village economy. A slave comes to collect 35%, and the peasant tenants beat him almost to death. It may very well be that the tenant farmers are the ones who once owned the land they're working on. They have become hirelings on the very land that has been in their family for centuries. Gospel of Thomas, Logion 65 continues. He sent his slave so the farmers would give him the fruit of the vineyard. They seized the slave, beat him, and almost killed him. And the slave returned and told his master. His master said, perhaps he didn't recognize him. He sent another slave, and the farmers beat that one as well. Then the master sent his son and said, perhaps they'll show my son some respect. Because the farmers knew that he was the heir to the vineyard, they seized him and killed him. Whoever has ears, let him hear. That might seem to us very extreme. One of the things upon hearing the story we have to ask is that scenario realistic or is that hyperbole? I mean, did that kind of stuff actually happen? Absolutely happen. In fact, we have found a great deal of evidence, much of it available in Egypt because of the dry climate could preserve the documents very well, like the Gospel of Thomas, for example, in which there are documents which describe exactly this kind of phenomenon happening with great regularity. Another thing we have to ask is, why the hell would Jesus get up and tell a story like that? Some scholars have wondered, is this even a parable? Maybe it's just a descriptive account of something that actually happened, something like news reporting. But even if we were to conclude, no, it's not news reporting, it's a parable and therefore a fictional story, nonetheless it's very realistic. It aptly describes the kind of labor violence that was occurring in the Galilee of Jesus' own time because of this vicious cycle of debt and foreclosure and the resulting upheaval of the peasant population in Syro-Palestine. If Jesus told this story as an example, what was he doing? One of the ways to expose evil, folks, is to hold it up for everyone to view it. Jesus could have told this story to remind people what was going on at that time in his culture. Not trying to encourage violence. Jesus was non-ego violent. But violence is going to happen. Maybe a scribe listening better listen up if he had ears. It was the result, this violence, of a kind of judicial theft and economic injustice going on that destroyed the lives of poor people. And we have some evidence that in its original form, that is how the parable was originally understood. One of the things that gospel writers did, including the author or collector of the original version of the Gospel of Thomas, was tend to collect Jesus sayings and Jesus stories that were all of one theme and stack them all right one on top of the other. Like the Gospel of Thomas here. Look at those different sayings, those different parables. See how they're all the same theme. This is not unlike how some homilists and preachers organize preaching material for each Sunday, with one example following another. In the Gospel of Thomas, we find 3 parables, one right after the other, each one of them describing economic violence as the result of this sort of injustice in the society. This suggests to scholars that whoever was the original collector of the Jesus sayings for the Gospel of Thomas, he understood this parable to be one more example of the kind of evil that was taking place in the society and that was ruining the lives of the poor. Now, we're going to see what became of that story. First, as it migrated from whenever it originated, through the time of oral tradition, and then finally showing up 20 years later in the gospel called Mark. Originally, again, this parable was a critique of power and the pursuit of wealth. But when it reaches Mark, well, folks, a few changes have taken place.